The motion for this debate is, this House believes that democracy should be a precondition for receiving international development aid. Without further ado, I invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. Please welcome Yi-Ning.
Money means utility, responsibility, and democracy. When people are dying every day, when they don't even have basic human rights, we cannot stand by and condemn this, but on the other hand, continue to provide them aid so that they can enforce their rule over the people, so that they can channel this fund to their military, so that they can continue to get these people and torture them. Something that is unacceptable, and that is why our side stands by democracy. Let's take a look at some definitions for today. Democracy would be a political system that's already established in most countries. It operates on a system of power to the people. What this means then is that measures like re-election by voting and democratic institutions such as the judiciary, executive, and legislative bodies are already established within the country. There is a respect for fundamental human rights within these countries, and this is checked upon by the system of the power to the people, where the people are able to vote for their own governments. No, thank you. Countries worldwide are already moving towards this establishment of democracies, such as lesser developed countries like Myanmar and countries in South Africa. We recognize that people within the countries also want this kind of democracy to be established, as evidenced by the Arab Spring, when people rose up against their dictators and called for democracies. There are varying levels of democracy within society, ladies and gentlemen, and we recognize even in the weakest democracies, there's this basic level of human rights, and we first need to work towards achieving that basic level of human rights before we begin to build up these democracies. And the only way we can do that is to kickstart it by providing developmental aid as an incentive, as an impetus. Let's take a look at what international developmental aid means. It means assistance usually provided by organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. No, thank you. This is provided to lesser developed countries on request, in recognition of their poor infrastructure and low human developmental index. This is either in the form of funds, manpower, or expertise. The side proposition needs to clarify this, that developmental aid is not equivalent to humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid addresses the immediate concerns within the country, issues like poverty, whereas developmental aid caters to the long-term development of the country and its infrastructure.
Madam.
By preconditions, we would mean that democratic institutions like the judiciary, executive, and legislative bodies would be implemented. There will be free and fair elections within these countries, and whichever country donates to these countries will check on the state of these conditions within the country itself. This already happens in status quo, such as Asian Developmental Bank providing aid to Bangladesh and then sending officials yearly to check on the state within the country, or tie aid to the Asian tigers from the USA for the creation of strong democracies. This therefore shows how there's precedent for this and how there's a need to establish democracy. As the first speaker today, I'll be firstly telling about saving lives, secondly about incentivizing democracy, and lastly about preventing corruption. My last speaker will be telling you about the consistency of the message to these dictatorial regimes and about the self-sustaining economy of these countries. On my first part, substantive on saving lives, the thesis of my argument is this: providing developmental assistance on the condition of democracy is the most peaceful means of achieving democracy, thus saving more lives. The international community is already consistently pushing for democracy within these countries. Why? Because there's either a call to action by the people within the countries themselves, or there's a recognition of the massive human rights violations that go on within these countries. In the absence of developmental aid then, what happens under their paradigm is that only three outcomes can occur. Firstly, the dictator remains in power and human rights abuse continues on their side, causing massive loss of lives. The second is that the people rise up in protest against the dictator to try and overthrow the dictator in a revolution. And the last one is that military interventions and sanctions are carried out to remove the dictator. All this results in one consequence: a massive loss of lives under their paradigm. That is why, on our side, we actually provide that kind of peaceful incentive for these countries to move towards democracies themselves, and we don't cause more lives in the process. I'm going to give you an example of how US military intervention in 1968 to remove dictator Patrice Lumumba killed 22 million people, causing a complete devastation of infrastructure where the economy declined by over 70%, showing how these kind of military interventions actually destabilize the country even more, hindering its progress of democracy and killing more lives in the process. Therefore, on our side, we save more lives, and that's why our side is better. Now, the second part is substantive, on incentivizing democracy. Yes, madam.
Explain to us how these dictators are actually going to help, are actually going to give your aid so what to these people, if you're saying that they themselves are the one that are going to oppress the people.
Madam, precisely because under your paradigm, these dictators aren't going to give aid towards the people. Under your paradigm, what you leave these dictators free to do is you leave them unaccountable to the people, which strengthens what you've just said, which means they take all this money for themselves. Under our paradigm, because there are actually democratic institutions to check on the dictator, this means that it leads to a far more effective use of this developmental aid because it actually goes to the people, something I'll elaborate more on later in my substantive. Moving back to my case. The thesis of my argument is this: providing developmental aid on the condition of democracy better incentivizes internal change and democracy. Providing developmental aid serves as a huge incentive for these countries to move towards democracy because they actually need this aid to further develop their country. They begin to establish democratic institutions within the country and means such as voting. What this does then is it empowers the people and it sparks further discourse within the country, it allowing the country to have internal reforms and internal change, which allows for a far more stable government and stable democracy in the long term because this comes from within. This therefore incentivizes countries to implement democracy, sparking a stable democracy. For example, after Japan received Thai aid from the USA from 1950 to 1962, their economy grew by 10% with the institution of strong democratic institutions. On my third argument then, on ensuring effectiveness of developmental aid, the thesis of my argument is this: democracies better ensure that developmental aid is used more effectively by ensuring transparency and accountability. The characteristic of democracy is increased transparency and accountability. This is because now that power is in the hands of the people and the government has to remain accountable to the people to prevent losing power, this means that they actually have to channel the funds towards the people. Democratic institutions serve as a further check and balance to ensure transparency and to check on where the aid is actually being channeled to. Therefore, this prevents corruption as the government can no longer siphon off this developmental aid for their own purposes. I'm going to give you an example of how odious debt, which is debt arbitrarily given to dictators by the African Bank, allows dictators like Mamadou Tanja to use this money to buy 14 Porsches, 2 villas and a zoo. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what happens under their paradigm. They don't allow for this developmental aid to actually be used to protect the people. Conversely, on our side, through establishment of democracy, we actually ensure the efficacy of this kind of developmental aid. We ensure that the people are protected under our paradigm because these dictators can no longer hide and they actually have to remain accountable to our people. Because our side truly stands for democracy, because democracy isn't just an imposition of values, but rather democracy is fundamental human rights for every single human being, I am so proud to stand on proposition.
Thank the first proposition speaker for her speech, and now to open the case for the opposition, please welcome Alicia.
Side opposition absolutely agrees with them when they pointed out that saving lives is something that's important we have to do. We think that development before democracy is something important that we have to preserve, and that their side hasn't exactly pointed out how offering this offer to these countries will actually convince these countries to turn into democracies. So, 2 points of contention for today. But before that, on our policy. We'll be giving aid to these countries without tying any conditions to the aid, as well as redistributing these aids by ourselves. For example, if a country is going in to give aid, then we think that this country should also go in and try to distribute the aid as much as we can. For example, if UN and NGOs are going to go in, they have to go and build, they will be building these hospitals and healthcare facilities on their own. This will directly target the problem of corruption and misallocation of resources that their side has been talking about. Now, I'll be speaking on, firstly, how you unfairly penalize people for the wrongs of the government, and secondly, how you legitimize these rule of these dictatorships and military regimes. No, thank you, madam. So before that, 2 main points of contention. Firstly, on their policy and their criteria, and secondly, on democracy. So firstly, on the criteria. We think that the criteria that they've brought about is something that is very easy to flout, which is why we totally contest the feasibility of their policy. When you're simply going to allow for elections and gauge by the effectiveness of these elections whether this country is really a democracy or not, we think that this will lead to further harms. When this country purposely meets the needs of your policy, when it purposely has elections, but rather buy votes in the background, we think that this is really the harm when people really cannot intervene after that, because it seems like it is really a democracy and you have no right to intervene from there. Now, on the second point, on achieving democracy. No, thank you, madam. Firstly, they came up to tell us that this idea of human rights abuses and that we should be combating these human rights abuses. But we think that the very main tension in their case is they haven't proved to us how we're going to be stopping these human rights abuses if we're going to use this aid as an incentive for these countries to accept. Because the very characterization of these countries is that for themselves, if they are going to abuse the human rights of these people, then they probably don't even care if you're going to take this aid away or not. Because this aid is not targeted at the dictator itself, it is not targeted at its power. We don't think that it's going to weaken his power at all. So we tell him, then after that they gave us this analysis that is internal reform that is going to drive the democracy, and it's internal reform and the people themselves that changes the dictatorship or military regime. We tell you that the characterization in this case, there's a kind of a tension and a contradiction here. Because at first, no thank you sir, they told us that in these countries they have absolutely no idea of democracy, they want to kickstart this democracy. Then at the same time, they tell us there's an existing middle class who actually wants to overthrow their government already. We tell you that, okay, on the first characterization, if there are already people who are really rising towards the middle class, then we don't see a need for the policy. If they're only going to rely on internal reform of the people to really overthrow their government, we think that if the people want it, they can get it themselves, and there is no need to dangle aid there as an incentive and really put people as a political battering ram and to threaten them that if you don't overthrow your government, we are not going to give you this aid. And it is also not true that for their characterization, if people in that country, no thank you madam, have absolutely no idea of democracy at all, then we think that the dictators themselves will really directly block any influences of democracy, especially when the nature of dictatorships and military regimes is that they can control the media, they control the things that get to the people, that these people are not aware of the kind of ideas of democracy that you're bringing to them. We're not just talking about countries in the Middle East where there's an Arab Spring, no thank you madam, but also military regimes like Mali and Congo, which may not have as much of a political empathy as what they have tried to bring to us today. And even if this political empathy, we still don't see any need for their policy. Now moving on to my substantive for today. I'll be speaking on how it is unfair to penalize people for the faults of the government. Firstly, I'll be proving why the policy does not work, because dictators will not be accepting this aid in exchange for the reform of their politics. So firstly, let us examine the nature of these dictators. Dictators don't create a dictatorship out of nowhere. Military regimes don't suddenly pop out of nowhere. It is something that's entrenched for the longest time with political ideologies that are backing up these kind of political systems. For example, maybe in Syria, that it's something that is long lasting. It is not something that has popped out of nowhere when there's actually a reason behind, for example, trying to protect the Alawites, etc. And we think that these dictators will definitely try to hold on to their power, especially when in aggressive mode, when you try to intervene militarily, they're already trying to protect their political ideology. No thank you madam. For example, how Assad is fighting this war to the death by using chemical weapons on its people. We think that especially when you're trying to go be nice by offering this aid in exchange for in exchange for a better democracy, that this is definitely not going to happen. And especially when this aid is not directed to the dictator himself, when it's for the people, we don't see any incentive for the ruler to even accept this aid in the first place. And they're willing to keep their people poor, as in how Joseph Mobutu stole $5 billion from his people. We think that there's no incentive for these people to actually give aid. No thank you sir. Now, even if they do accept this aid, we think that one, it's going to be harmful because of brinksmanship. When they purposely achieve the criteria in a certain way, when they really need this aid. And we think that this is bad because it doesn't really create a democracy in a sense, but instead, it also results in half-built hospitals, half-built facilities. When you achieve the aid, then it's taken away, and it goes on and on and on. We think that ultimately you're going to harm the people the most, the ones that need the aid. And on the second point, we think we create a pseudo-democracy. When people think that it's actually a democracy, when it's not, when there's just elections for the sake of elections, like seen in how Robert Mugabe is still ruling, and people are voting him back in, despite it not being actually a democracy. And we think that it becomes harder because the lines are blurred, and people and the international community cannot intervene as much. Hold on a minute, man, because they see that by criteria that these countries are still democracies at the end of the day. Yes, ma'am.
When the only alternative you give these countries is military intervention, tell us how you're...
Madam, we are not saying that the only alternative is military intervention. We think that you need development before democracy. And by allowing for a rising middle class, that you allow for this democracy to come up. And we'll be explaining this later on in my substantive. So, because you don't allow these people to really achieve the kind of democracy, we think that they fail on their part because they create a pseudo-democracy that can come with even more harm. And we think that this aid is very important to these people. Why so? Because it is not as their characterization, it's not a very long-term thing. We think that it's simply wrong for them to say that poverty it only comes about with humanitarian aid. We think that developmental aid also targets the problem of poverty, and we think that it's something important that we have to deal with when people are hungry and people don't get enough food on their table. We think that there's also a characterization of how transport networks are there to allow for accessibility of these resources which these people need. And ultimately, we cannot punish these people for the faults of the government. Also, we cannot be putting the onus of these people to really try and overthrow their government in order to get the aid that they so want. We don't think that we should be using aid as a way to force people to overthrow their governments, especially when they're not equipped the way to do so. Firstly, because they're not given as an education, when they're not allowed to be the rising middle class, when they're not given the necessary aid that can allow them to really do whatever they want to their governments. We think that by their policy does not achieve this, because it is on our side, on our comparative, that we actually allow for these people to really create a general rising middle class, like how it's seen in Turkey in this year, when they were able to successfully overthrow Tayyip Erdogan. And we think that it's this kind of situations which best allow for the creation of a good quality democracy, which is not achieved on their side either way. Because we think it's also ironic that they are simply allowing a democracy and force on these people. At the end of the day, we are the side that best protects democracy, we are also the side that best protects people. Go with side opposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 7 seconds.
I thank the first opposition speaker for her speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Aloysius.
Testing. How exactly did opposition ensure development in these nations that wanted developmental aid but were run by ruthless dictators who redistributed the money into their own Swiss bank accounts and used it to purchase villas and Porsches? No answer from their side. Instead, the underlying thrust on opposition was the need for democratization to come after economic aid had been developed. Yet, if there was aid before democracy, what incentive would there be for these countries to pursue a path of democracy in the first place? Opposition gave them no incentive to reform and instead allowed far more people to die. They never answered the fundamental question of, without the carrot of developmental aid, how countries will be able to move towards a democratic regime without resorting to violent measures. They gave us a very half-baked policy, even when this was an evaluative debate that didn't require one in the first place, but anyway, we'll take it down. In these authoritarian regimes, there is no effective means for They told us that in authoritarian regimes, there is no effective means for external parties to have a check and balance on certain mechanisms. Yet in their own policy, they mentioned external observers moving in. If there were a means to check, then it also works on our side, where we ensure that developmental aid is used for the correct purposes, and developmental aid goes to where it is needed the most. From these weaknesses in opposition's case come 3 points of contention.
Stop.
No, thank you, madam. Firstly, on penalizing the people. Secondly, on quality democracy. And thirdly, on their responses to my first speaker. On to the first area of contention, on penalizing the people. Here's where they gave us an entire substantive on how we unfairly penalize the people of these developing nations by denying developmental aid, but by putting the condition of democracy. Firstly, it's not true, because under their side, dictators already penalize the people in terms of the gross abuses of human rights that they commit, in terms of the siphoning of funds. Not once did they contest our characterization of dictators as siphoning funds of the people, and indeed conceded to that in the midst of their rebuttal. Rather, what opposition allowed for is corruption, as my first speaker brought to you in her substantive. How developmental aid would instead be channeled through the mechanism of aid drain. I'll take you in a moment, madam. How developmental aid would be rechanneled through the mechanism of aid drain, preventing the people from achieving any sort of tangible benefit. Go ahead.
If dictators were so evil as you pointed that out to be, tell us how this aid is going to act as a carrot for them in any case.
Madam, because the dictators realize that they need the money. However, what this check and balance does is prevent them from abusing it in any way. Where democratization is the requirement, we ensure that the dictators implement reforms and democratic reforms to ensure that the aid produced does not go to all these alternative methods, does not go to their evil endeavors, but rather is achieved on a solid democratic foundation to where the people need it, to where it is needed the most. We give you the example of Zaire. The opposition allowed dictators like Said Siko Mobutu to channel funds toward their own personal bank accounts to purchase gregarious villas and build their own private zoos. This was completely unjustified. On to the second area of clash, on good quality democracy. It is fundamentally untrue that opposition allowed for better quality democracy when democracy couldn't take root in the first place. We've already told you how there was a lack of incentive for these nations to develop their democratic systems. In fact, what opposition does allow for is a smokescreen, where dictators can somehow put on the deception of democratic reform and then receive developmental aid before they even go on to reform. This was completely unjustifiable under their paradigm. On to the third area of clash, on their responses to my first speaker. They offered no concrete response to our first substantive, on how other means of installing democracy were far deadlier than offering the carrot of developmental aid. Indeed, their first speaker conceded that lives would be lost in the struggle for democratization. Rather, what opposition compels people to do is, without the carrot of democracy, rise up and allow them to violently overthrow their own dictators. This was completely unjustifiable, as they allowed for situations like Syria, Turkey. They allowed for violent revolutions, uprisings, or worse, military intervention. This was all logic that we gave in our first speaker, logic that they haven't sufficiently addressed. They allowed dictators to clamp down, and this was wrong. I'm now transitioning to my own constructive argument, firstly on the consistency of the international message. The thesis of this being that making democracy a precondition for developmental assistance strengthens the message for democracy that the international system is attempting to relay. The premise of this point is that under status quo, the global community has been delivering a very clear message that democratic reform is desirable, that democratic reform is something for countries to strive towards, and that attempts to violate the principle of rule by the people, that going against the will of the people would be dealt with harshly. This is why we have global action against dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, such as international sanctions and official censure by supranational organizations. However, should the international community provide developmental assistance via the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, even to undemocratic regimes, the clout of the pro-democratic message and stance is dangerously undermined and diluted. In this situation, the international system would be perceived as contradicting its own stance, a philosophical push-pull disconnect that ultimately weakens the message that they are trying to send. This is irreconcilable, and they delivered aid where it was not ended up in the correct ends. For example, the provision of developmental aid to the maximum government undemocratic regime of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe resulted in harsh censure by the international community, by parties such as Norway and Australia, as contradictory towards the general stance of censure of Mugabe's authoritarian rule. Therefore, in order to ensure that the watchword of democracy is not undercut by the unconstrained channeling of funds, and that consistency in the international community's stance is preserved, democracy should be enacted as a precondition for developmental aid. Now transitioning to my second argument on creating a self-sustaining economy in the long term. The thesis of this being that democratic systems are in a far better position to use developmental aid so as to create a more resilient economy for the country's future well-being. No thank you. The fundamental characteristic of authoritarian or undemocratic regimes is the poor allocation of economic resources, where ineffectual, centralized systems intended to act out of the dictator's self-interest or to entrench government controls make no recognition at all of the needs and voice of the people, and are therefore unresponsive to changing economic signals. The result is an economy that is unsustainable in the long run, having no effective means of adapting to demand or responding to change. Developmental assistance is outright wasted on these structurally flawed systems. We give you the example of how the undemocratic government of the USSR, through the economic agency of Gosplan, ruined its economy through rampant mismanagement, even though they had aid flowing in from their Eastern European satellites. Conversely, democratic institutions are far better equipped to allocate developmental aid precisely because the people's needs are heard and met. For example, democratic governments of Ghana and Bangladesh were able to make the most of aid from the World Bank and Asian Development Bank respectively, with both building the requisite infrastructure such as roads, railways and factories precisely where it was needed, precisely through the mechanism of the vote. Opposition didn't achieve this at all because they provided the aid regardless of whether democracy was in place or not. And in the end, they resulted in the wastage of these funds and no tangible benefit to the people. And so in the final analysis, democracy should be a precondition to ensure the creation of resilient, self-reliant and stable economic systems, that relief is made to its maximum possible extent. Because on our side, proposition, we have money, utility, responsibility and democracy.
For 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Sunil.
We aren't going to prove to you today on why democracy should be a carrot stick for developmental aid. Instead, we're going to tell you that we don't need to prove this at all, because we've already told you that there should not be an incentive for aid at all. We believe, right, that we've already told in our first speaker that aid should be given to these people who need it most. It is unfair and unprincipled and not principally justified, and in fact morally abhorrent that they are going to hold this carrot over the people's head and tell them to overthrow their dictator before we give them the food that they need to live, the water that will help them to live, and the infrastructure that will better the quality of their lives. With that, I have 3 main rebuttals for the case of side proposition today. Firstly, on the contention of our policy. Secondly, on really understanding the realistic nature of how dictators will react and whether their policy will still function in such a scenario. And thirdly, on the idea of the penalization of the people. Firstly, the idea of our policy. We told you that our policy, we completely take away this idea of corruption and how their entire line of logic of how in a democracy this aid can be better and more sustainably used. No, thank you, ma'am, does not apply at all. Because we already told you, and this is actually happening in the status quo as well, but how UN, like for example, UN as well as people who will provide aid in the international community will actually come into the picture and distribute the aids by themselves. Like we tell you that there also be things about how like they come in and they build the buildings by themselves. It is not a fact that these dictators will take away this aid and give it to the people, because this aid is being given directly to the people already. We see that there is no middleman scenario in this situation. And we completely, no thank you sir, think that they have misunderstood our argument from the start, and we don't think that they should continue to do this in their third speaker today. Next, on the idea of how dictators will react, in which I'll prove to you how their case is completely unfeasible and does not serve their own goals of helping people realize their own democracy. So, no thank you ma'am, let's take a look at how dictatorships actually function, how these authoritarian regimes actually function and how they clamp down on the people. Let's first see what they have told us today. They brought us the idea of how they are able to help people facilitate this grassroots kind of movement, where they are able to create this democratic, they are able to push for democracy by themselves. We've told you that it's extremely unrealistic to expect the people to do so. What are dictatorships? Dictatorships are basically authoritarian regimes where the dictator holds absolute power over this country. We see that by absolute power, it extends to the kind of things that are being proliferated in the media, no thank you ma'am, which obviously affects how people are going to view and perceive their own country. We see that in many of these dictatorships, the people have extremely limited kind of quality of education. This coupled with the kind of media control with the dictatorships is going to affect how people see their country. In fact, we're going to tell you, and this will be further in my substantive later on, that the people are not going to realize this at all, and this only serves to the dictator's own benefit when they're able to use this to entrench their own rule. We told you that this kind of analysis was brought to you by our first speaker, and they have not dealt with this at all. Rather, what happened on side proposition was that we gave to you, or side opposition, was that we gave you a more realistic understanding of how these dictatorships work. No thank you ma'am. We told you, right, that it's highly unlikely that these dictatorships will allow such a precondition to be even accepted by their own country, even if we do, even if we think that in the unlikely scenario that the people will pressure their dictatorships into doing so. We brought you the example of how Assad, even when confronted with military intervention, will fight to the end of the war in order to cling to his own power. We think it's highly unlikely, no thank you sir, that suddenly when you act nice to these dictators, even when we've shown you that military power still fails and these dictators cling on to their power, they will suddenly decide to play nice back to the international community. This is simply not how dictatorships work. We don't think that they actually understand the reality in this situation. And even if we told you that they do accept this condition, we told that what comes out of this situation is a pseudo-democracy, and that is even worse. We brought you the analysis that the countries will only fulfill these requirements on paper and not actually follow them through in reality. We gave you the example of Robert Mugabe, which they also talked about, no thank you ma'am, in their own example, and we told that this simply buttresses our case. We tell that through this creation of a pseudo-democracy, where it looks like they have a democracy, where they have like voting and so on, what goes on behind the scenes is actually more pernicious. When we see that these dictators, no thank you sir, like Robert Mugabe, are actually buying votes, are actually engaging in electoral fraud, it becomes much harder for the international community to actually see what is going on and how to best solve this situation. We tell that because of this kind of policy will never come into fruition on side propositions world, and in fact, it's only better on our side. Here we give the idea of consistency as well. We tell that consistency should not be upheld if there's no consistency in the first place. There has never been an international standard for an internationally accepted standard across the board for this kind of democracy. We've told you the example. We're telling you the examples of like how the United States actually supported dictatorships in Uzbekistan and Bahrain, and we think that because of this, we don't think that it's fair to say that it's a consistency that to adhere to at all, but there is simply none. Moving on to the last idea on the penalization of the people, which is a huge point on our side of the case today. They told us the idea of saving the lives of people through military intervention and how we've not proven there's any alternative. In fact, we told you that the alternative on our side of the case is that we are simply going to allow this developmental aid to come in. No thank you ma'am, which is the organic kind of change for democracy that we want to see, which has been proven to you by my first speaker, not dealt with on their side at all. Beyond that, we tell you that it's harmful on their side when these kind of things come in, even if the people do somehow like get to the point where they realize that democracy is important. We think that what happened is that the dictatorships will only clamp down on them even further, and this is harmful because it helps the people even further and kind of and completely obliviates the idea of democracy from this country itself. With that, let me quickly move on to my substantives, if I see I've run out of time. So, on this idea of legitimizing the rule of dictatorships, which I've talked about briefly in my rebuttals, but I'll be further elaborating on in here. Hold on a minute, ma'am, which I'll be further elaborating on now. Yes, ma'am.
You legitimize dictatorships by giving them funds to assert their rule over the people. And
no, ma'am, I've already talked to you in my policy that I've spent so long on my rebuttals, but you still have not heard me. I've already told you about how in their policy the aid will be given directly to the people. We don't think that this should be a contention anymore. Moving on back to my substantive for today, we talked about how the dictatorships are essentially have absolute control over the media, have absolute control over the minds of their people through a kind of personality, through kind of how they broadcast like selective information that is in support of their own state. Why is this significant? We tell that this is significant because it changes the perception of how people view their own countries, of how people see their own like governance, and how they perceive like what is really good in their own lives or not. This affects the ability of them to actually counteract any kind of oppression that the dictator may be exerting on them, because they're simply not privy to the kind of oppression, no thank you ma'am, that is exerted on their country. We think that in this scenario, any kind of external influence of democracy is not going to pervade into the country when the dictator has such a control over the media itself. We tell that this is harmful in their side of the case because the dictator will feel even more defensive and clamp down on any kind of thing. We tell that in fact better in our case when we allow for the development to actually come into the people's life and make them more receptive to the kind of external influence today. Because we recognize that many people in these countries are essentially adverse to international coercion, and we tell that the best way to do it is to allow them to give them this aid, to tell them that hey, we are here to help you, not to dangle this kind of incentive in front of you and pretend that we want to help you in the long term. This is a more direct way of doing so. We believe that this is the best way to impact their lives. This kind of development to democracy will only come about in this scenario because we best allow the people to answer their basic needs first. We tell that the essential answering of these basic needs is extremely important because then they're able to move on to the higher levels of needs where they consider whether they want democracy or not. And at that point, we think that organic change will definitely occur. With that, we show you today how development will lead to a natural progression of democracy and how democracy does not necessarily lead to the same kind of development. Instead, we've told you how the policy on side proposition is essentially not going to be realistic because they have not given us any concrete characterization of the kind of dictatorship. And we've told you that this side of the House on side opposition will only benefit the people as well as helping democracy fulfill its goals. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for her speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Annette.
Opposition assumed that the minute developmental aid was not made conditional, some magic would happen and democracy would be implemented. That was their first key fundamental assumption. But when we pressed them, they just hid behind their policy. That was the key fundamental problem, secondly. When they just hid behind their policy and claimed that we have the UN officials coming into our countries. We have UN observers and ensuring building roads and buildings for these individuals. But when you examine the very mechanism that they talked about United Nations observers, these are the individuals who will be ensuring democracy on proposition as well. And that is why it can come about on proposition at the end of the day. And that is what my first speaker told you within her stance and when examining what happens within reality. So therefore, it also can happen on proposition, and opposition simply needs to stop hiding behind their policy. So now let's deal with this debate in two main points of contention for today. Firstly, on what's best for the people, and secondly, what's best for the country. So now let's move on to the first idea, what's best for the people. Under this was our first substantive on saving lives, on where we prevent things like military invasion and these sorts of uprisings. And the only response we heard was a concession that internal reforms are good because of the fact that people uprise and they can solve their own problems. But that also means that they concede that in the process of these internal reforms, 100,000 people die in the process as well. But what our proposition does is we provide the alternative to ensure that there is a peaceful means of transition to democracy at the end of the day. But even if, let's give you additional reasons on if we take their argument that internal reforms are good, let's tell you why that's too bad. Because firstly, like I said before, people die. But even if internal reforms do not ensure that smooth transition to democracy because of the fact that you have no individuals guiding you, and what happens is that the country is simply thrown into a situation where they are unable to build up the democracy slowly. And this is what my first speaker told you within her stance as well, that it's going to be a slow transition to democracy, and that is why it is comparatively far better, even if we take their argument that internal reforms are good because the people died. So now let's move on to the second idea, on their first substantive, where they told us that it's not fair
to the people because of the fact that these individuals suffer. On the first day of analysis, my second speaker already told you why it happens anyways. Because everyone within a dictatorship more often than not suffer from severe human rights abuses anyways. But let's give you additional reasons for why their side is even worse. Because what happens now is that you grant these dictators the veneer of legitimacy, that whatever they are doing within these countries is legitimate because of the fact that even though there are such severe human rights abuses, the international community is not doing anything about it at all. So therefore this gives dictators even more reason to clamp down harder on their individuals because they know that the international community approves of such action. They know that the international community will not do anything to stop them at the end of the day. So that is why their side results in even more lives and even more individuals being sacrificed. But now let's move on to the last idea, where they try to tell us, where they try to bring us the idea of will it be accepted at the end of the day? And this was a very fundamental question within this debate. But when you listen to their own kinds of characterization, where they brought us examples of Omar al-Bashir, where they cling on to power so much, precisely because of their own characterization, without granting them the... No, thank you, madam. Without granting them that particular incentive, it means that these individuals will never ever be able to take their policy at all. Because listening to their own example, in the face of military intervention, these individuals were still able to cling on to power, all the more so that alternative viewpoint is needed. Because when the stick doesn't work, it's time to offer the carrot to ensure that these individuals have that particular incentive. So that is why our side is comparatively far better. But even if that gives you additional reasons for why our side still does what is better, because dictators are not monolithic in nature, because there will be individuals who are incentivized to change to democracy. Therefore, as long as even one more individual takes that transition towards democracy, it means that 1 million more lives are being saved at the end of the day. So here's where we draw a parallel to things like where countries already tie international development aid to protection of the environment, and countries do actually take it. For example, Canada provided this sort of a conditional on environmental protection to Haiti, and in 2008, Haiti took concrete steps and set up the Ministry of Environment to ensure that these places were going to ensure. No, thank you, madam. We're going to ensure that the environment within Haiti was going to be protected. So therefore, outside, once again, that's what is better comparatively. So now let's move on to the second big point of contention on what's best for the country. And this was their second speaker's first substantive, where she told us about these individuals have absolute power. But before I move on,
explain why dictators who are so evil are going to accept the aid and try to get the best for their people.
Madam, first and foremost, by telling us that these individuals cling on to absolute power, your policy doesn't work either, and you undercut your own policy at the end of the day because of the fact that now these individuals no longer have that peaceful alternative at all, but rather in the face of that, like your side has conceded, military invasions will not work as well. So therefore, all the more we need that peaceful alternative. So now let's move on to back to my case on their first substantive of absolute power. Let's just point out that the idea of media control also exists on their side at the end of the day as well, of censorship and picking selective information. It exists on their side as well. But let's tell you, and the only solution was we have UN individuals once again coming in to tell the people what is happening and why your side should be free from censorship. Let's give you an analysis of why it's even worse. Because when these United Nations individuals come in without the dictator or without the ruler or the government necessarily accepting that policy, it means that these individuals are going to be seen as even worse because of the fact that governments firstly don't approve of it, but secondly, these United Nations officials are simply just coming into the country to spread ideas of liberalization and spread ideas of non-censorship. So that's why their side is even worse, because they result in the dictator clamping down even more because of the fact that he sees that these United Nations officials are coming in without any sort of reason or any sort of purpose at the end of the day. So that is why their side is comparatively far worse. But then they try to tell us that, oh, at the end of the day, our side is simply going to have a pseudo-democracy. But first and foremost, they already undercut it by their own policy. But even if our side is a pseudo-democracy, it's why we have to work on it through the idea of having inspections, like my first speaker already told you, within her policy. But more than that, opposition side results in no democracy at all. And here's where we have to draw draw the fundamental distinction that their side results in no democracy because these individuals simply cling on to power even more. But then on the second idea, where my first speaker told you her second substantive on the incentive for change, and the only response we heard to this was within their first speaker in a one-liner that it will not weaken these individuals' power because the aid is not targeted to them. But when you examine the mechanics of what it happens, it often comes in like what my first speaker told you in terms of financial aid, in terms of resources, and more often than not, it goes into funding these individuals' zoos, these individuals' kinds of military, and that's why it's even worse. But even if, and that's why it does tackle the problem at the end of the day. But more than that, they also drop the idea of how it prevents the long-term stability of the country, which was a substantive brought to you in my second speaker within his second substantive. This was one entire idea completely dropped. And with the idea of a consistent international stance, they just told us that there's great democracy anyways. But I already took that idea down, and therefore their point doesn't stand. So therefore, because we truly do what's best for democracies as well as for the people, I am proud to stand on the side of responsibility and democracy.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
I thank the third proposition speaker for her speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Charmaine.
The problem with ACJC is that their policy is completely dependent on the goodwill of dictators, which doesn't really make sense. Their policy is dependent on the fact that dictators realize that, I perhaps need some developmental aid for my people, and therefore I should start changing myself. And we don't think that kind of characterization is true at all, given that they themselves said that dictators are oppressive towards their people. Dictators don't really care about the lives of their people. And that's why our side is coming in, where we recognize the dire conditions of the countries that we're talking about, and we best save lives both in the short term and incentivizing long-term democracy plans. I'll be elaborating on this in 2 points of contention. Firstly, who best ensures an increase in the quality of life of the people? And secondly, who best ensures that there will be a long-term stable democracy that will be in place in future? Now let's look at the first issue of who best ensures increase in quality of life of the people, which is basically saying who can best make use of the aid that is given by various charitable international organizations. Now they've continuously told us that we aren't able to ensure that the aid will directly go to the people. Now look, if they think that they can use officials to check things that are so intangible, like democracy, if they think they can check, somehow go behind the scenes to look at every interaction that's taking place in a country and check whether or not there's democracy in the first place, then we think for the very same reason, right, countries and organizations are going to find out whether or not a huge ton of construction materials have suddenly disappeared, no thank you, from the place where they were originally supposed to be built. And for the same reason, we think this kind of tangible, physical forms of aid aren't simply going to disappear into mid-air, because these observers are going to come here to monitor all this in all these resources. So thank you. Then they told us how how these dictators will consider the UN and all these organizations as spreading their liberal Western ideas in their country. Now look, which is the side that is more intrusive in the running of the country? Their side, which forces them to adopt democracy in exchange for aid, or our side that we just go inside to give them aid? No thank you. It's simply obvious which side best ensures that aid will go to the people and best ensures that dictators will accept the aid. Let's look at what their side is doing. Their side is forcing people to somehow, in their dire living conditions, forcing people to somehow find some way to organize a revolution against the dictator. Never mind their poor education, no thank you. Never mind the lack of resources. Never mind the lack of alternative and lack of dissent and discourse in the country. And go through all this difficulty just so that they can get hospitals, just so they can get education. No, we don't think that this is right in any case. Now they think that they want to do this to preserve a consistent stance of the international community that's an anti-dictator stance. What we say is that the the international community prioritizes lives over everything else, which is why outside is the one that best ensures consistency by ensuring that the international community sticks with its stance of lives over anything else. And this is how we best ensure the quality of lives of the people in our paradigm. On the idea of human rights abuses, right, we think it's essentially a question of who better ensures democracy, and I'll be explaining this further on my second contention, which I'll proceed to go on now. Now, secondly, on the idea of who better ensures a long-term and stable democracy. Now, Prop has been incredibly confusing when it comes to how exactly they want their policy to allow for some democracy. But before I move on here,
Even if countries were to do that, what's then the incentive to take democracy?
the incentive to take democracy, the incentive to take democracy isn't we don't think that the governments themselves will go towards the democracy path. Instead, what we want is for people to slowly recognize that, and as people go gradually more developed and into a more civilized society, when they have education, they're exposed to all the ideas in the Western civilization, Western liberal world, and when they have their basic priorities met, and they slowly begin to demand greater and greater freedoms in the country, which is parallel an example that we've constantly given you, the things like how the rise of the middle class in status quo now, in examples like the Turkey this year or Brazil, and all these examples show how once people fulfill their short-term needs, they gradually begin to demand long-term reforms and long-term stability because they have a greater stake in this country, they have more interest in this country. We've continuously given you this analysis, not sure why they don't understand it. Now moving on, we think now why side proposition has been confusing? Because on one hand, firstly, they say that they want to use it as a carrot for the people. On the other hand, they tell us that dictators realize that they need the money and therefore there will be some sort of internal change. Now, we think that they haven't exactly resolved this, even though we've continuously pushed them on this. But let's look at both of these ideas, right? Firstly, on the idea of how it's a carrot for the people. Now, this only works, no thank you, if we're talking about a context where people are already rising up. And the basis of that assumption means that it's already quite developed, that people are beginning to think, look, maybe this form of government isn't necessarily the government that I want. And at this point in time, this is when people begin to realize that, look, there's this offer, no thank you, and therefore I should probably use it. The problem is that kind of situation isn't happening right now. We're talking about these developing countries with really, really poor living conditions. No thank you. And you're basically coercing them you definitely have to revolt, otherwise I won't give you the aid that you need to continue your lives. We think organic change, only occurs when you satisfy the people's basic needs first, and then after that they begin to because they are more developed, they have access to health, they have access to education, and they have longer lifespans, and they have more time to think about look, this form of government isn't necessarily the best, and my rights are getting exploited. This kind of high level thinking, no thank you, can only achieve if they're not too overly preoccupied about their life, about whether or not they're going to die from AIDS the next day. Now moving on to that second characterization of second thing that they told us, that look, we need an incentive for dictators to for some reason suddenly change their policies and become democratic. No thank you. The problem is the money isn't actually going to the dictators' pockets, and we don't see how in the world is an incentive for dictators. Instead, it's going to make dictators even more angry or even more close up to the wall. And when they see that there's a Western form of imposition on them, and that's why we think that if governments are actually that oppressive, if governments are that uncaring about the people, they're not going to accept, no thank you, the policy that they brought to us in any case. That's why there's not going to be any form of democracy in the first place. Now, even if, we brought you the idea that even if they accept democracy, it'll be a very pseudo form of democracy, right? A lot secret, and they said that they'll check this kind of things. The problem is these are all secret behind the doors things. When politicians go to many different villages, then because they're so poor, they exploit that fact and buy votes to get re-elected over and over again, which is worse because the international community can't exactly intervene anymore because technically it is a democracy by their logic. That's why we don't think that they have sufficiently dealt with the problem of pseudo-democracy. We think that on the idea of who legitimizes the rule of democracy, they said that the international community is essentially legitimizing the rule of the democracy. Not true at all, because the thing is, international community, the aid goes directly to the people and not to the democracy itself. In fact, they are funding the people who are going to be the very roots of the anti-dictatorship movement in the future. And even if in that best case scenario where they achieve a form of democracy for some magical reason, we don't think that democracy is going to have the participation of everyone if the majority of people are going to be suffering in that period of time when the democracy is in formation. For all these reasons, because side opposition best ensures the lives of people, best ensures democracy, go with the opposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for her speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, please welcome please welcome Alicia.
We think that at the end of the day, there is no point to a democracy if politicians end up buying votes from people who are extremely poor because they're not given the aid that they so need, and they continue to be perpetuated against, and they continue to suffer all these human rights abuses. We have contested their policy many times, and we can see that side proposition has gone on the defensive. So three main points or 3 questions for today. Firstly, on the effectiveness of side proposition's policy in achieving their aims. Secondly, on who best protects the people, and lastly, on who best protects democracy. So firstly, on their policy, we've continuously pushed them on the effectiveness of their policy by giving them clear characterization and analysis on how dictators work and what developmental aid really is. When dictators themselves are perpetuating such crime towards their people, we don't think that they are going to be the ones who are going to be accepting aid as a benefit towards them. Especially when we told you that developmental aid are the things that go straight to the people, and it's not going to directly affect the dictator, especially when it is in the dictator's interest to continue to exploit these people and to continue to keep them poor and to continue to keep them under his feet. So we don't think that their policy is going to work in any case. Then they told us that our policy will not help either because internal reform is bad and this internal reform cannot be catalyzed at all. We give you very clear analysis on how on our side, when we give aid to the people, when you give them the education, the appropriate healthcare, it is a time where it is a natural progression towards democracy. When you start thinking about what they really want in this country, we don't think a hungry man is going to have as much impetus to fight against his government, against human rights abuses if his basic needs are not fulfilled. Which is why we think that our side best catalyzes the rising middle class. And then we came towards this moot point where they allowed for the rising middle class, and then we allowed for the rising middle class as well. Then they accused us that the rising middle class is something, a revolution is something that will result in a very big loss of human lives. We told you that this loss of human lives is something that we have to, that will come naturally with every revolution. So we think that this is a moot point that we don't think that they should be contesting. Now, on the second question, on who best protects the people. They told us about this idea on how you have to protect a consistent sense of democracy. Then we told you in our third speaker that basically that you need to protect the very basic principle that every in the entire world protects in the first place, which is really about saving human lives and protecting the people and ensuring that they get the aid, especially when we have the resources to really help these people out. And also we gave you a very clear analysis on how it is not fair to penalize these people because they don't receive the aid in the very first place because the dictator is not going to accept the conditions they are tying to this aid. And also they are not equipped to try and change and reform this government that we are having a problem with, because we cannot push the onus of really resolving their government issues onto these people, especially when it is the government who's in control of the political landscape in these areas. We don't think it is fair to put this burden on the people, especially when they're not equipped with any aid at all to try and overthrow this government in order to get the aid that is so needed. The only response that came from their side is that they are already penalized by their own dictators. We say that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. That doesn't mean that just because someone is already perpetuating harm towards these people doesn't mean we cannot help, especially when we have the available resources and available resources to help. Now the second question on who best protects democracy. We told you that at its best, we tell you that the quality of the democracy will be bad even if the dictator accepts the conditions, because this will only result in a pseudo democracy, which is even bad because the international community cannot intervene anymore when the lines are so blurred, when people think that the conditions of a democracy is even fulfilled, especially when a dictator can secretly continue to clamp down his people when small groups try to have an uprising instead of a big group who is empowered by our side, which is actually given aid in the first place. Then we also then they also gave us this idea about how the international community is actually legitimizing the actions of these people and enhance democracy. We tell you that it's worse if there is no active action in giving aid than allowing the dictator to continue perpetuating these harms as they've already been doing so in the first place. With all I'm saying, I'm very proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
And now to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, please welcome Aloysius.
Blindly providing the carrot or measured carrot and stick. These were the two wildly different approaches that the two sides in today's debate adopted in attempting to deliver aid to developing nations. From there came two different countries which received developmental aid and varied in two very important aspects. Firstly, on what was best for the people, and secondly, on what was best for democracy. On both counts, the world of opposition crumbled in chaos as the people struggled and died at iron fist. And on proposition country, we stood strong and moved forward into the future. On to the first area of clash, on what was best for the people. Opposition never understood the nature of developmental aid, even as we outlined it very clearly in our first speaker, that entities like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank would provide funding to governments with government supervision in order to channel to the relevant areas. It was thus imperative for governments to have democratic functions before aid was provided. Opposition's flawed policy had no precedent in status quo and was fundamentally flawed in terms of external check mechanisms. In essence, their policy needed our paradigm to work in the first place. Opposition never understood why dictators were incentivized to accept our approach, even as we told you how the needs of development were weighed in their own decision-making calculus, and even as we told you that it was necessary for their own countries, and thus prompting democratic reform. Opposition wanted quality democracy by organic change, but gave no impetus for internal reform to occur at all. They instead allowed dictators to run rampant, as they always did. And it was worse so on their side, as the element of corruption arose, a key substantive that opposition never fundamentally contested. They instead agreed that dictators were greedy, that dictators were evil, and they allowed aid to be siphoned off slowly, and the people would never see a single cent. Instead, it moved away to Switzerland to comfortable bank accounts. Here's where our own side substantive on creating a self-sustaining economy came in. How the long-term effectiveness of developmental aid was contingent on a solid democratic platform. Again, unresponded to on our side, and so they conceded that long-term prosperity was only ever truly achieved on proposition. Opposition insisted, instead, as my third speaker expounded on, allowed for dictators to be even more punitive in their rule and kill hundreds of thousands or more people. On to the second area of clash, on what was best for democracy. Opposition penalizing the people. Never mind that immediate aid was already provided by humanitarian aid, a key difference that they never truly understood. Never mind that dictators already penalized the people themselves through their indiscriminate action. Never mind that opposition implicitly pushed for democracy to be achieved by even more violent means. They wanted lives before everything else, but by freeing and arming authoritarian regimes, they only succeeded in destroying lives. This was undercut by the entire idea of censorship, where they falsely equated development with democracy, and never fundamentally explained why democratization would even ever come about and their paradigm. We did. We clearly told you that it was the carrot, and only the carrot, that sparked democratization by way of peaceful transition. Ultimately, they gave no heed to our substantives on incentivizing democracy, how through logical analysis we expounded on how dictators' own decision-making calculus demanded it. They said the people in their countries wanted democracy, but even if they did, they never told us how this wanting would translate into any real democracy, when their side only legitimized dictators and gave them no incentive. Therefore, it was more quasi-pseudo-democracy on the side of opposition. In the end, they doubted the consistency of the international community's stance on democracy. Never mind the precedent that has been set by sanctions and international censure. In the end, all opposition did was embolden dictators, while our side brought them down. Because it was on our side that we gave money, utility, responsibility, and democracy.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 9 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the debate. Please wait in the lecture theatre while the adjudicators deliberate on the verdict.